This video is about the transgender cycling world champion Rachel McKinnon, who was born a male and is now competing against women in sports. Before we dive into that story, I want to get some background to some of the issues swirling around this subject. Trevor Phillips, writing for The Times, warns us of politicians and identity politics and that trans extremists are putting equality at risk. For 4 decades, Western leaders were so determined to prove their anti-racist credentials that they ignored the signs of growing public unease about our multi-ethnic societies. The outcome, Trump, Brexit, and the steady advance of truly racist and anti-immigrant movements. The disaster of the public consultation process on gender recognition has revealed a government so terrified of being labeled transphobic that it is ready to destroy half a century of painstakingly assembled anti-discrimination legislation to the detriment of every woman, person of color, and disabled individual in Britain. Under the current law, a change of gender requires a 2-year period of reflection, medical checks, and possible physical alterations. It is a grueling process, and proposed reforms to the Gender Recognition Act greatly aim to make the process less bureaucratic. However, agitation by a guilt-tripping band of trans activists has corralled MPs, that's ministers of parliament, into contemplating a wholly unnecessarily and dangerous further step. It is seriously being suggested that we should do away with any objective test of gender and leave the decision as to whether an individual should be treated as male or female entirely in the hands of the person themselves. In short, a man would be able to declare himself a woman and immediately have every right to enter spaces reserved for women. Changing room, lavatories, prisons. The feminist objection to self-declaration has already been made on these pages, not least by Janice Turner, who has been subject to shrieking abuse by some bullies from the trans lobby. Many of these people were born and still are male by most people's standards. The fact that in at least one case, women in prisons have been sexually assaulted by a woman who happened to possess a penis would give most of us pause for thought. Yet the otherwise sensible MPs on the Women and Equality Select Committee have backed self-declaration, and startlingly, David Isaac, my admirable successor as chairman of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, has announced that he favors demedicalization, a way of allowing men to become women without the inconvenient step of ceasing to be male. I can only imagine that many of those supporting this insanity believe that they are displaying empathy for a group of individuals who have suffered genuine anguish. But this is certainly not what I had in mind when, along with the other authors of the 2010 Equality Act, we fought to include transgender as a protected characteristic in anti-discrimination law. The truth is that, far from encouraging empathy, extreme trans activists and their allies are adding a new layer of cruelty by raising false hopes that changing gender could become as easy as changing a name. The problem is this: if self-declaration becomes established as a principle for one protected characteristic, gender, why should it not apply to all of the other 8, including disability or race? It is hard to see how the law could resist the claims of a man who, despite all medical advice to the contrary, decides that he is mentally disabled and therefore should be eligible for disability benefits and time off work. The human and financial costs would be horrendous. I can already hear outrage at the comparison. The activists will complain that equating gender with disability is yet another example of galloping transphobia. But why shouldn't a society ask individuals to pass objective tests to acquire identity status? Without criteria other than personal preference, it would be impossible to decide whether some groups truly suffer disadvantage, a big issue for women and people of color. The measurement of gender and ethnic pay gaps would become instantly unviable, since no one could be sure that those who declared themselves to be black women actually were black or female. The self-declaration principle, masquerading as compassionate recognition, risks making a mockery of the struggle for equality. If ministers give in to trans zealots, a white man would merely need to say, "Today I'm a black woman. I might not be tomorrow, but hey, who cares? Well, I do, and so should everyone who genuinely believes in fairness." Trevor Phillips writes from a perspective of equal rights and indeed social justice. Speaking from a different angle on the subject, Julian Vigo, writing for Quillette, warns us that trans activist campaign against TERFs has become an attack on science. The term TERF is an acronym for trans exclusionary radical feminists and used as an insult to shut down the opinions of people who consider themselves as gender critical. While the culture war skirmish over transgenderism typically is treated as a debate about culture or sociology, it is also a debate about the primacy of science, since many of the shibboleths we are asked to embrace are either scientifically dubious or obviously inaccurate. And while the debate over whether sex is a mere social construct, it's not, or whether biologically male brains can exist with female bodies, they can't, may seem abstract, they are concrete. Real-world effects when girls as young as 13 are being told by U.S. physician Johanna Olsen Kennedy that they have the capacity capacity to make reasoned, logical decisions about whether they want their breasts removed, because if they want breasts later on in their lives, they can go and get them. This sort of casual attitude to body mutilation and remutilation helps explain why many enterprising doctors have become de facto transgender activists, since they get paid on both ends of the transformation. There was a time when self-organized groups within the medical profession could be counted on to debunk outliers within their field, but the nature of transgender activism is that small groups of committed extremists can ram through their agenda by threatening to denounce their critics as transphobic. The major transgender medical lobby group, World Professional Organization for Transgender Health, has issued a statement declaring ROGD to be nothing more than an acronym created to describe a proposed clinical phenomenon that may or may not warrant further peer-reviewed scientific investigation. Gender-assigned surgery is a huge growth area for enterprising doctors, and WPATH has every incentive to bury concerns over ROGD, even while claiming it encourages continued scientific exploration within a culture of academic freedom. The extraordinarily aggressive nature of today's trans activists means that women's spaces are now being invaded by male-bodied individuals across the board, from rape crisis centers to gym locker rooms to prisons. It also is turning many female athlete competitions into a joke, because male-bodied athletes who identify as transgender often can best female competitors. Rachel McKinnon also presents as a world-class female cyclist. This month, McKinnon gleefully ascended the podium at the UCI Masters Track Cycling World Championship alongside the women who won runner-up status. As third place, some would say second place, finisher Jen Wagner-Asali tweeted, "It's definitely not fair." But like other activists in this field, McKinnon seems to inhabit a fantasy world in which the difference between male and female athletic performance dissolves amidst the great complex and messy and beautiful diversity of human body types more generally. Everyone involved in the sport knows this to be nonsense, but are fearful to say so, lest they be called, in McKinnon's own words, transphobic bigots. Even in disciplines far removed from athletics or the white-gown world of hospitals and clinics, pressure to toe an extremist line on transgender issues is undermining academic and intellectual freedom. The journal Philosophy and Phenomenological Research recently published 2 articles, one by trans academic Rachel McKinnon called The Epistemology of Propaganda, and another by Jason Stanley, Replies, within the epithet TERF, trans-exclusionary radical feminist, is casually flung about to attack women who oppose a trans-maximalist agenda. The attack on women contained in these articles was so scathing that a group of philosophers were moved to publish a guest post in the philosophy blog Daily News entitled "Derogatory Language in Philosophy Journal Risks Increased Hostility and Diminished Discussion," pointing out that TERF is at worst a slur and at best derogatory. It has also been pointed out that McKinnon's paper contained at least one flat-out falsehood: the claim that there is no case on record of a transgender woman sexually assaulting a woman in a female-only space. Human beings are mammals, and in phylogeny are within the domain Eukarya, under the class Mammalia. With the influence of evolutionary processes that began possibly over 2 billion years ago, through the study of bioenergetics, tells us that in mammals, the males of each species have a higher metabolic rate. There, of course, come some obvious advantages to males, although there are downsides, such as issues with mitochondria-related diseases and apoptosis or cell death due to the higher energetic rates. Quoting the eminent British geneticist Sir Ronald Fisher, "No practical biologist interested in sexual reproduction would be led to work out the detailed consequences experienced by organisms having 3 or more sexes. Yet what else should he do if he wishes to understand why the sexes are, in fact, always 2. Most are aware of the extremely rare cases of intersex. These are, of course, exceptions to the sexual binary in mammals, and the subject certainly does deserve a thoughtful discussion. But let's move right to the subject of being assigned a gender or sex at birth. This is the great myth made loud and in your face by the trans activists today. Doctors do not assign a gender. They report what sex you are at birth. Think about it. If you are a healthy male or female born with either the XX or XY sex chromosomes, you will invariably require the care that is appropriate for your biological sex. The best way for physicians to care for their patients is to know what they are. Males need not waste time or energy going to an OB/GYN. Calvin Freeberger for LifeSite News says, "Male who compared sex distinctions to segregation wins cycling championship." Rachel McKinnon, a Canadian-born philosophy professor, just beat every woman aged 35 to 39 at this year's Union Cycliste Internationale Masters Track Cycling World Championships, despite being a biological male. McKinnon, who is on the faculty at South Carolina's College of Charleston, won the women's sprint 35 to 39 age bracket in Los Angeles on Saturday. Cycling magazine reported, first transgender women world champion ever. McKinnon boasted on Twitter he defeated female competitors Caroline van Herkhuizen of the Netherlands and Jennifer Wagner of the United States in the quarterfinals. But while pro-LGBT groups such as Pink News are celebrating the news as a milestone for equality, critics argue that letting men who merely declare womanhood compete with actual women puts the latter at an unfair disadvantage. McKinnon spent part of his Sunday disputing the point on Twitter, arguing that there's no relationship in any gender between endogenous testosterone and performance. Yet, USA Today quoted McKinnon in January as declaring that the truth about performance advantages was largely irrelevant because recognizing trans women in sports is a rights issue. By catering to cisgender people's views that further transgender people's oppression, she declared, when it comes to extending rights to a minority population. Why would we ask the majority? I bet a lot of white people were pissed off when we desegregated sports racially and allowed black people, but they had to deal with it. At the American Thinker, Rick Moran summarized McKinnon's comments as arguing sports is not really about competition anymore, reducing it to just another extension of the culture wars. While elite female athletes will defeat many males, they cannot defeat elite male athletes who will beat any and all women, no matter how well trained and in excellent shape they are, he argued. This is a fact of nature, of good old-fashioned science, and no amount of pretending otherwise will make a difference. Moran accused athletic governing bodies that have surrendered to transgenderism, which include the organizers of the Olympics and the Boston Marathon, of pretending to agree with McKinnon because they and most female athletes are terrified of a backlash from social justice warriors. Whether human rights for trans people also includes things like competing in sports when you have different equipment than the people you are competing against is another discussion we need to have. Forget science for a moment. On its face, it just doesn't seem fair for someone born with significant advantages over others to be competing in the same league. Some ask, why not just dissolve the male and female segregated sports and have all compete as just people? We're all equal, right? Is this what you want? Maybe separate but equal genders in sports is akin to the professional leagues in the United States in the middle of the last century. When you look at a Major League Baseball team in the 1930s and see only white men on the teams, does that mean they are the best our society has to offer? Fast forward to basketball and some other sports in 2018. Does black, male-dominated sports mean that these are the best athletes in the country? It's very likely since now no men are kept from participating. So why not close shop on female sports and roll them all together with the lads so we can compete on an even playing field? I do think there will indeed be some amount of biological females that would be able to compete with adult males, but more than likely at the very top of women's participation in a genderless sports league, it would be dominated by men who now identify as women. The fact that professional sports has such high stakes, there are going to be people that intentionally abuse the system for their own gain. I'm not saying that males who consider themselves women would automatically have bad intentions. I still believe in the goodness of human nature, but I also acknowledge that there are outliers who will do whatever it will take to achieve success. There are always the bad apples that ruin it for everyone else. Trevor Phillips brings up some points that are immediately dismissed by the trans activists. If you self-identify, what is to stop people from competing in disabled sports events? The trans activists sneer at this proposition. It's not the same, they say, and indeed it isn't. However, dismissing out of hand the mere fact that if we did not allow a physically able person to compete against the less able, we could, by their very logic, be discriminating against self-identified disabled people. And don't get me started on otherkins. So let's talk about basic human rights. There is not a person on the planet that should be treated more or less equal than another. So forget about all this tolerance nonsense and get right to human consideration. We shouldn't be tolerating each other. We need to respect one another and extend all courtesies to each and every person we meet. So, someone identifies as trans or any other thing they want to. That's fine. Let's not confuse people that disagree with trans ideologies as somehow being hateful or bigoted. I'm talking to the trans activist community now. You want to be respected and afforded all the liberties by everyone else, but you refuse to accept that there are some that do not share your view on the subject of trans identity. But it's more nuanced than that. Most of us, even those so-called TERFs, accept their trans brothers and sisters as people, as fellow human beings. What they don't accept is the ideology that says a woman can have a penis and that a lesbian is transphobic if they refuse to have sex with a woman with a penis. If the trans activists are busy being activists, then it can only mean one thing. They are active in countries that allow people to be who they are. You know what I'm talking about. Just try having a pride parade in countries dominated by Islam. So focus on being who you are and stop being intolerant towards people who disagree with you. Goodbye.